All right, hello everyone. Question in the back for our AV team. Is it better if I use the microphone or if I don't? Okay, great. Of course. All right, well, welcome everyone to How Do You Do Technical Recruiting Without Bias. My name is Jocelyn. I am the current head of people at Lambda School. Lambda School is an online technology school that teaches courses in web development, iOS, data science, and UX design for no upfront tuition. And we're also a talent solution for organizations seeking to hire diverse technical talent. Our student body is about 59% non-white and 23% women. So diversity is a topic that's top of mind for organizations large and small, from enterprises to early stage startups. And this is something that employees actively bring up topics on. What are our diversity initiatives? What are our inclusive policies? And at least in my experience, candidates are beginning to ask earlier on in the process about our team composition and what kind of practices and values we have as an organization. And that's taking up a place up front in the process. And diversity is also something that's picked up momentum in a lot of the social spheres. So it's not something that I see going away necessarily, and it's on companies to really think about how we might change to adapt to the way our society is going. And also, there's research that suggests diverse teams are better for business. And so in a survey of companies, those that were in the top quartile for ethnic and racial diversity, 35% would experience above average returns. And also, when decisions are made and executed by diverse teams, they make better decisions 60% of the time. And so the research would indicate that perhaps diverse teams equals a better bottom line, which I think all organizations could say is a good thing. So this research, I can follow up with the article. There were a couple that were published in Forbes and elsewhere. I just don't have that top of mind right here. But happy to forward those later on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Lambda School's journey. So we are only about 2 years old, turned 2 in May. I joined in late 2017 as employee number 18. We ended last year, 2018, with 40 employees, so doubled. As of today, we are approximately 140 employees and on track to be a 200-plus organization by the end of the year. And the way we hired in the beginning is much different than how we hired now. In the beginning, as with most companies, you start with an idea, and you're trying to hire anyone who's willing to come work with you on this idea because the risk of it not working out is pretty great. And what that looks like is you might hire people that you know, that you've worked with, or worked with people you know and trust, because there's that relationship, and you maybe more or less know what they're capable of. And that's how maybe some of your early teams start. And I can say that that's how I was hired. I knew the co-founders through my own path, and I'll dive into that a little bit later. And that's good for the beginning to get a product up to market, out there, start to prove a point. But as you continue to grow and hire, you really need to start thinking early on, what kind of company do we want to be? Not only in terms of our product and our service to our customers, but who are we as a company? How do we relate to our employees? What is our culture? Because all of that, I believe, will have a direct impact on the company's success. But where does all of that begin? It kind of begins in our hiring process. And so that's where I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. It's just general hiring process and how we can shape them to achieve maybe our diversity goals, our inclusion goals. So that's a high-level story kind of Lambda School's journey to date. Some other kind of just facts in there is I was one of the first female hires on our leadership team, and also the only ethnic person on the team. All of my other colleagues were white Mormon males, which at the time made sense given where our co-founders were Mormon and how you hire through who you know. So that's where that began. Sorry, I don't use clickers often. There we got it. Okay, and so this is a little bit about my path. Right out of college, I joined a boutique interior design firm. There were 4 of us, 4 women, and we were age spans from 23 to 73, and each of us came from a different ethnic makeup. Then in 2013, I founded my own company, startup, with 2 of my college acquaintances, 2 males, myself, and we each came from our own ethnic background as well. Later, fast forward to Hack Reactor, joined as I think number 60, 65 in an organization that was fairly diverse in terms of men and women, but age-wise, we were mostly 24 to 35, very, certain age group there. While at Hack Reactor, I filled a lot of roles and eventually had a heavy hand in our hiring process and thinking about how I build that out, which is, why are we hiring for this? What skills do we need them to have? And how do we build out rubrics that we can just pass to anyone who might be in the hiring process? Fast forward, joined Y Combinator as a batch director to oversee the founder program, which is where I actually met Lambda School, because they were one of my companies I was responsible for. And because of that relationship and my past history kind of in startups and in tech, that's how I initially landed at Lambda School. So I'd like to chat with you about something I called the Lambda X story. It's related to hiring and diversity for our company. Like I mentioned earlier, when we started, I was the only female and ethnically diverse person on our leadership team. We as a company recognized early on that that is not what we want. We wanted to be a more diverse team. The question is, how do we get there? What do we need to do to get there? It can be easy to say, do this, but what does that look like in practice? I do. I have 2 bachelor's degrees, one in politics and another in economics. Yeah, so I do have those with me. And so the Lambda X story. Lambda X is the team that's responsible for the labs portion of our courses. Labs essentially simulates an on-site environment for developers. So we put them in teams, they work on their own projects, onboard to other projects. As we scale our class sizes, we also internally scale our teams. But what does that look like if we make a decision as a company that requires a team to scale very rapidly? So like this team, it was like, okay, all of a sudden we need 8 team members, we need to hire them within a month. If we don't have them, then everyone here on the existing team is going to be putting in extra hours. We're already at bandwidth and don't feel like we have enough time to do the things we need or want to do. Also, on the other side of it, we want to provide world-class service to our students. The best way we can do that is to hire. This team from the outset was not very diverse. Eventually, we were able to even out kind of the men and women on the team, but still was missing some of those other perspectives. But the things that we're balancing against, like I mentioned, is like bandwidth and burnout, the need to have people in the seats right now, but also wanting to have that diversity component. And when I say that, it's not only because we want our staff to be that way, because staff are interested in it. It's actually really important and key to our business because our students are very ethnically diverse. 59% are non-white and 23% are women. If you're aware of some of the tensions in tech, it's how can these populations feel like they're going to be successful if they don't have role models, whether they are their actual teachers or people on their teams later. And so that I bring up the Lambda X story because we have those hiring constraints. We need people now. Additionally, we have the skill set we're seeking is very specific. We would like engineering directors and managers who are interested in transitioning in their careers to be mentors and teachers. So it's a difficult skill set to fill, likely has a higher salary expectation than a startup's able to meet. But we also have to think of who might be occupying those positions right now, given the way tech has naturally evolved. So those are kind of what we're up against. On the other side of it is there was an example that came up where someone had put together a slide deck and said, this is an amazing development team. And it was a team from a prolific company. It's like they're very successful, but the people in the photos were all white men. What does that signal to our students if that is what we're teaching and providing as an example? And so that caused an internal discussion that we're actually in the middle of kind of working through of how do we immediately rectify this, what are the next steps we're doing. But that's this kind of the scope of the Lambda X program. So I want to point that out because this workshop is how do you do it. This is how we are thinking about it and approaching it. But I'm going to ask everyone else here, how do you do it? Because this isn't something that any company has solved. There are good ways to do it. There are maybe ways that kind of work but don't necessarily drive at the specific aim. And so I see it that way. I see you had a question? What Lambda does. So on one side, we are a school. We teach courses in technology for no upfront tuition.
So you charge the fee, your private school, right? Your privately owned school?
Yes.
Okay. So you charge the fee, and how long is the school?
Our program is 9 months long.
Okay. And then they come out and meet every program, which they can.
They should, yes.
Good. Can they replace them, or do you people come to you and say, I need somebody in this,
So it's a little bit of both, right? We will not be successful as a business because of our financial model if our students do not get jobs. So we're incentivized to help. A fee for the company that's hiring them or fee for the student. Right now, there's no recruiting fees. So if you would like to work with us, we say, send us your JD, let's have a conversation about your culture, all these things. We will match you with 5 students that we believe best fit this profile, and all we ask is that you commit to interviewing all 5 of them and you provide us feedback.
All right, so where does the bias for companies that want to hire? Do you see a bias of companies that want to hire people in their school?
I would say there are bias in different ways. My school is one where students are coming. They may not have a high school diploma. They might not have a college degree. And one bias, especially in the technical industry, is what previous degrees do you hold? Right? So that's one front in which we are trying to tackle is question to you, what are the skills needed to do this role? Our students have these skills. Would you like to hire them? Oh, why not? They don't have a degree. What's the difference between that? It's sort of like a conversation. Yeah. Okay, cool, of course. Yeah, bigger picture. Any other questions before I move on a little bit? All right, perfect. Oh, no, I like it, but I like discussion more. So this slide deck we could just throw away if we wanted to have a different kind of conversation. So that just kind of sets it up a little bit here. So this was going to open it up to, what are some of the issues that your teams or organizations face when it comes to diversity in hiring. Ours are bandwidth issues, need to hire very quickly. The skill sets might, the pool of candidates with this skill set might not be diverse to begin with, but we have this absolute need because it's the best idea for a business. What are some issues that your organizations encounter? Anyone? No issues. Yes? I don't know. Okay.
Pressure's on now that I'm holding a mic.
Got it.
Okay, so I work for a Canadian nonprofit, and we have lots of diversity on our teams across Canada, except our board members are all white men. And so we've actually had people bring this up in interviews on like how this looks, how they're not sure they want to join the organization because of this. And so we're just trying to figure out, of course, we also have a policy on diversity, and then staff are questioning like, well, what do you do? Like, put your money where your mouth is, kind of. And we're like, oh, well, we don't really know. Again, we can say, anyone can be hired and we're open to everyone and we can say all these things, but like, how do we actually act it out and put our money where our mouth is what we're kind of struggling with. And also, when we're hiring for the board, how do we go about it in a different way so we get different applicants?
Okay.
So I don't have any answers. I just have all questions.
Okay. No, I love that. So what I'm hearing you say is some of those questions are like, okay, we have higher diversity initiatives, but how are we doing them? How are we fulfilling them? And when it comes to the board member side, right, board members have a very heavy hand, or maybe not, in the direction of a company. So how do you find people who are qualified in the industry or whatever to fill those seats?
Yeah, exactly. They're like CEOs that have retired but still want to have one foot in the door, and so typically it's been a pool of white older men. So yeah, I guess we're just trying to figure out like what's the first step in kind of changing that.
Okay.
But again, very inclusive, open to hire everyone. We're in Toronto. We're super diverse just because of where we are. Toronto, I think, is the most diverse city in the world. So, yeah, I guess that's kind of what we're facing.
Okay. Anyone facing similar or different problems in their organizations?
Yeah, so I work at Root Insurance. It's a car insurance startup based in Columbus, Ohio. So you could probably guess that being in like the Midwest Columbus, like there's some challenges with diversity there. And one of the things that we've been struggling with is like exactly what you were talking about, like how do you balance like needing to hire people yesterday with like, okay, but we want a diverse team, so like what do we do with that? And I would say too, like we have pretty great, like pretty solid like overall gender diversity, especially in like different pockets of the organization. Our executive team is 50% male, 50% female, pretty wide diversity of ages. Racial diversity we definitely need to work on. But like with engineering, we see like a lot of course, like the way that tech has gone, like we see a lot of the white males, especially like once you get to those like leadership positions. Like I don't think we have a lead female engineer yet. So working on a lot of those things. And so we balance like tiptoeing around like we need people yesterday, but we need a diverse team. So we source, but then there's also like the added layer of Columbus not necessarily being like as diverse as we might hope that it would be, and then trying to get people to relocate to join our team, because we are largely based in Columbus. We have a couple of other like disparate offices, but generally like very, very centered in Columbus. And the organization is not yet ready to like really dive into remote work yet. So I think that would alleviate a lot of that, but like it seems like we have a lot of constraints that we're like up against.
Okay, definitely. So it's can be lack of maybe diverse populations within your immediate area.
Yes.
If your company is not open to remote, which could be an outlet, that's another question.
Right.
How do you entice people to relocate?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'll be able to address some of these in my presentation, and others I'm happy to chat offline or as a group if we have time about what that looks like.
Cool.
Could be as way as like how to pilot remote work for this initiative. Okay, wonderful. Yes.
I feel like you should have it. Really?
Yeah. It's for the video.
My question is just, what do you think is the best way to benchmark expectations for diversity? Right. So in the example that you just gave, if you're in Columbus, Ohio, what is the percentage of labor pool that let's say is Latina? If that population percentage is 2%, if you have a 3% Latina rate of hire, you're actually exceeding, I think, diversity expectations relative to the available labor pool, relocation notwithstanding. So some jobs are more amenable to relocation than others. Like you're probably not going to get someone to relocate for like a fast food job, right? Like just as an example.
Yeah.
So like if we're running a Taco Bell in Des Moines, and you have like you're benchmarking against population statistics, I wouldn't expect a diversity rate of 50%. So I don't know what you think is what is an appropriate benchmark.
I think that's a great question, and I am someone who tends to trend maybe away from hard quotas per se, or percent makeups of teams, because my approach at least is more through philosophy and process, because I think if you can set your philosophy and you have a good process, that through that combined with what are your company policies that may or may not be attracting or be off-putting to different folks, I think it's all of that, and then we can start getting into what's a makeup of the staff of the team, because I think some of those, like from first principles, I believe these things need to happen first for us to get to that point.
That makes sense. I agree with that. I just think it's both labor demand and labor supply that are going to affect how you do. So I'm not even suggesting a quota. I'm just saying, like, if you want to understand from a leadership perspective how you're doing, or whether you need to change those internal things to change your messaging.
Yep.
Are you doing good or bad at hiring, recruiting, retention?
Yeah, your workforce really has to reflect the census of your neighborhoods, right? So if your workforce reflects who's around you, then you're in pretty good shape, right? But the real issue about your diversity of your workforce really stands for federal contractors. That's who really measures that. But really, you're doing pretty good if your workforce resembles your neighborhoods, right? I think
That's what I'm asking. I mean, I don't know. I think it depends on the job, because if there are jobs you can
Correct.
locate, then
Yeah.
maybe data science hires or remote work, it's a different criteria.
Yeah, much different criteria. And I will fully acknowledge that.
That's true. You're for different jobs.
And where I'm coming from an ed tech startup where our HQ is in San Francisco. We also have an office in Utah, and then a large remote workforce. So the circumstances of my company and the companies I've been part of are going to be much different than, say, like you mentioned, like a Taco Bell and Des Moines, which is a fair point. So I'm not sure that I can address that right now, but happy to noodle on that a little bit later.
I think the challenges in terms of diversity and hiring don't just cross like race or even gender. You're talking about overcoming the hurdles, right?
Yeah.
Overcoming the hurdles of education.
Yeah, there's a lot of different
So to
ones.
Get that across to companies, like, what do you mean you want a JavaScript developer, but they don't have a degree, so you're not willing to look at them?
That's one way.
Possible employment.
Yeah.
Right? That's one of the challenges you face. So I can tell you that in previous companies I had that same challenge, they wouldn't even consider it. And I'm like, you're being short-sighted, because pretty soon the pool of candidates, even that have 4-year degrees, are gonna really diminish, and you're gonna not have anyone to fill your jobs. That's the truth, right? There's gonna be
Yeah.
1 million more technical jobs than there are gonna be people to fill them.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to start thinking outside the box. There are people that are going to be self-taught, not even going to a coding camp, that are going to fill these roles. And if you don't take them, someone else surely is. And they're going to speed by.
And I can think about that in tech, but I also think it can generally apply, like the ways to address can apply to recruiting generally. So ways that I think that to address some of the problems both in the Lambda X story, but just with recruiting in general, and how do we, make increased diversity of our teams. I think first it comes from a commitment of the leadership. Our company, even early on, the composition I noted you to, it was everyone else, not me, they would come to me and say, like, this is a problem I see right now. I only see it getting bigger. How can we get ahead of this, right? So that's something that's been top of mind, and by commitment of leadership, there's different levels. One is they're committed to having that conversation, and they're saying it, right? They're saying that we value this. I actually had to call out my team at one point because I said, hey, you say these things, but you continue to hire folks in the same way that you have, and that is exasperating the problem. You've asked me to help with this. Please lean into this process that I've created. Let's have a hiring process to begin with, because this is, we are 6 months old at this point, and how to get a commitment to saying, from the team saying, yes, we will use this process. No, we will not just hire people outside without looping you in or putting them through a process that measures them against other candidates. Because fundamentally, that will now maybe increase the diversity of our teams, because we're actually looking at folks who are applying to us. So it takes commitment at different levels. And I've had to ask my leadership team to recommit in different ways as we grow as a company, because the diversity policies or initiatives grow in scale. And so maybe that would be a question for your company is the leadership actually committed to the idea that the board needs to be different, or are they just saying it? How are they acting day to day? Like, what are their actions that say that they're searching for that? And then I think another way to address this is actually looking at your systems and processes related to recruiting and hiring. Diving into how are they composed? Do you have a hiring process? Like, say you have a role, is the hiring process the same more or less for every candidate? Or is someone different interviewing them at each time? Are they asking completely different questions? Are we comparing apples to carrots? If we're doing that, there's no easy way to say these candidates scored this way in these areas, and therefore we're going to hire the best candidate. Instead, that trends towards who did I feel the best about when I met with them? which is not necessarily going to help on that front, because we're more likely to hire people that we jive with that are more like us in some way if we're not holding ourselves accountable to some other criteria. So the way that I think of it is in 3 parts. It's the funnel, it's the initial evaluation of candidates that come into your pipelines, and then it's the actual interview process. And so what I mean by funnel is, have you dove into the language that you're using in your job descriptions? Are they accessible to people? Is it curating towards perhaps a certain group or not? For a while at my company, hiring managers were writing their own JDs, and when I would review them, I could hear their voice in there, and they would use different terminology that might be more aggressive or not. And so one of the things that we do in our JDs, we're in the process of auditing, because rapid growth, sometimes the JDs can get away from you, is, what do we as a company want to convey in our job descriptions? What kind of place is this to work at? Because when it comes to attracting candidates, period, we want to know what it's like to be there. We can convey that in the words that we choose, of like how we're outlining duties and responsibilities, or how we're describing the company. But also secondly, are we relying on referrals only? Are we relying on people applying through the front door? If we are, then we're only using our own networks. If we're relying on people to apply through the front door, then it's the assumption that everyone knows about us, or that maybe there's only certain subgroups that are aware of our company. For Lambda School, we got a lot of our initial attraction through my CEO's Twitter account. Who uses Twitter and is prolific on it, and who might actually be following my CEO? It's probably folks who work in tech, live in the Bay Area, and are already in tune. Is that necessarily going to increase the diversity of the candidates that are applying through the front door? No. So one thing that we do is we try to think of, okay, for this role, it is on this team that might be leaning this way in terms of composition. Where are we sourcing our candidates? Are we making the effort to find other channels? So for certain roles, especially on our instruction team, we're like, we would like more women, we'd like more diverse candidates, and when I say diverse candidates, I mean ethnic and racial, but I also mean from varying life perspectives as well. So can we post them on Tech Ladies or on Shift if we're interested in getting veterans? Taking the time to source both those like organizations that might be working on a national level, but also what are some local communities that are trying to help populations break into tech or whatever industry. So we challenge ourselves to look at the health of our funnel and where our candidates are coming from. And that's a system and process change. Secondly, it's how do we initially evaluate candidates that do apply? We usually get a cover letter, a resume, and what do? Most of the time, we're actually just looking at like, what past companies did you work at, and what were your job responsibilities? We're not necessarily needing to see that you worked in the same job 3 times somewhere else, because sometimes a unique job set is actually what we're looking for. So we try to base it on like, what skills are you saying that you have? What companies have you worked at? We might look into what kind of products that company makes to see if there's some sort of like fit in a way that we're trying to go. But that's more or less what we're doing when we're looking at that initial phase. And I think the crux of it all comes into the interview process. For my company, we value folks who are mission driven and dedicated to our values. So our initial phone screen is values focused. We want to make sure you're bought into the things that we believe. One of our values is student obsession. That's meaning we want to do everything we possibly can so our students can sleep at night, do well in the program, and get jobs. Other things that we are into in terms of our values are act like an owner and go for it. If you have an idea, are you someone that just lets it sit there? Or are you someone who brings it up to other people, figures it out like, great, I have this idea, I think it solves X, Y, and Z, it's out of my domain, but I think we have to do it. Do you try to corral people? Do you write an MVP? Are you, as an early stage startup, we have a lot of things that need to be built. We have a lot of systems that, aren't perfect. Are you someone who's interested in making those things better? Those are things of more like thought process and how they relate to the values we would like to see in our employees, and that's number 1 phase. But for the interview process generally, for any role, we actually have our hiring managers build that out up front. What are you looking for? What are the skills that you need? How will you measure if someone has those skills or not? And what does that look like? And so therefore we build out an interview process that we can apply to every candidate that we decide to interview for that role, so we're measuring them the same, which I think is a key aspect. Another area in the interview process that we are starting to implement, we're doing it first with our Lambda X team, because that's one where we it's come to some tension within that team. We're implementing the Rooney Rule. And what the Rooney Rule is saying that I will see 20 to 25% of candidates that at each interview stage come from a diverse background. That can be difficult to do, because it's not only evaluating the candidates that start at the interview process, but you really need to track it through the funnel. And that takes time. It might take sourcing, but that's something that we've decided as a leadership team is important. We get our management to also buy into that idea and to commit to it, and then therefore commit to that during the hiring process. And we need that commitment up front, because that's how we balance the pressure and need to fill this role. Is because we've all agreed that this is important. On the other side of that, what if you do run into a situation where you've done all these things, you have the interview process, you've increased your funnel, you followed the Rooney Rule, but the best candidate is not a diverse candidate. In our case, we will still hire the best candidate, but we as an organization have shown our commitment to diversity by putting this through by running this process, because we believe that the process will give us the best candidate, but we've been thoughtful about who our candidates are throughout the pipeline. Any questions? Yes? This is something that we are starting to build out more. We don't do that right now. I'm in the process of piloting it with our Lambda X team. This is also a function just as an organization. We've about 5x'd our hiring this year. Because of the process that we've laid out, we have been able to diversify our team very heavily and naturally that way. But I think this kind of gets into metrics, right? You can look at the diversity of all of your staff. Are we doing well there? I think we are. But then we dive into the individual teams, and now what is the composition of those teams? And I think that's also equally important, which is something that we are starting to tackle with the Lambda X team specifically. So that's why I think how do you do technical recruiting or recruiting without bias generally, it's really difficult. I think it comes to having a process that everyone's bought into and finds value in, and that we hold ourselves accountable to running through it. I often have hiring managers that come to me and say, so-and-so referred this person, I've talked to them, they're really great, they meet all the boxes this way. And you're like, okay, great, but who else have they met with on the team? Do they only meet with you, the hiring manager? Do they meet with someone they're going to be working with, a counterpart elsewhere? Part of the interview process, and is an area that we are even more further developing, is who are on our panels, right? Who are candidates meeting with is equally important, especially if you want to attract diverse candidates. Can they see themselves there or not? Like no interviewing at all. Just pick, how would you pick the candidate?
Well, I hypothesis that I tested where managers actually outperforms what a lot of humans can do. Because more about that, I think people. So frankly, like the companies are loath to experiment in things that they don't think make sense. So it's often counterintuitive or hard to promote change without experimentation. So let's say you ran that experiment, flip a coin, whether an applicant thought they were qualified, whether or not, and that outperforms, would you implement a random chance model? Probably not, right?
I would say that generally we're open to experimentation. I think that even with a hiring process that we have in place, there are ways that we may deviate and feel comfortable about it, but part of it is making that conscious decision to do it versus just letting it happen. So is there a case where we implement a coin flipping and it works somehow for this team? Maybe we put that in the back of our pocket of like, do we need to make a quick hire some way? Are we open to leaving it this way? But we might need to track that candidate slightly differently to prove out that model.
I just think there's a lot of opportunity in hiring to identify different sources of information, which we
status quo models work. Like we assume people are good at picking things. We assume that like we know things that we don't. Like even what you were describing, like people assume that you need to go to college to have certain skills. Not true at all.
Yeah.
I never look at resumes. I've hired a lot of data scientists and technical people. I never look at resumes before I hire anyone. And I've accidentally hired people who were terrible and had PhDs from Stanford and MIT, and I've accidentally hired people who have zero educational background, like Annie Quinn, best data scientist I've ever hired. I still to this day have no idea where she went to school. If she went to school at all, I don't care.
She's great.
But she's great because I matched on skills. Some jobs you can't do that. So and especially with leadership, you have these amorphous, homophilic tendencies that people think are right. So people think, oh, when I think of a leader, I think of a white guy because that's what people think about. And that's just like I am. So therefore leaders look like I do. And they went to Princeton and they did all these stupid things that make no sense and have no association with leadership other than that's how I've associated leadership in the past. That's homophily, that's suboptimal. So of course that's going to self-replicate because you're fishing the same pools.
Yep.
But it's the same model that you're describing, which is a good model. But I'm just saying, like, you can always experiment and try things that you don't think are right. Maybe you're wrong. Like, no one knows. I don't know. I like to try different things. But it's very hard. It's a challenge for all employers. I've been doing this for a long time where you tell a client, where you say, hey, you want to be more diverse, change this, do this differently, or experiment. You think you're telling me this is the way to hire the best VP? How do you know? And they're like, oh, well, we've had success. We hired Joe, and look how great Joe is. You're like, yeah. So you're never, like, give up on diversity. Like, my answer is, like, great. Give up on diversity, stop pretending, and go back to hiring white males because you're just going to self-replicate, and stop pretending like you care about diversity. That's my answer when they say that. Like, give up. If
When
you
they
don't
when
care,
they
if you
say
don't
that
wanna try,
this is the way to do it.
they're like, oh, well, we know, like, the problem, like, here's this thing. I actually just did this, I don't want to hijack your
No,
talk,
go
like,
ahead.
I just gave this presentation to a room full of people who are on public boards, like Pepsi and ConocoPhillips and Home Depot. And they all were lamenting. I was on a panel with one African-American woman who was on a bunch of those boards, another woman and me. And they were all lamenting how impossible are the words that everyone used, and everyone's nodding and agreeing, to find qualified African-American women to be on publicly traded boards. And even my panelists were like, impossible. Other than Mary and the other people, like, no, it's very rare, very impossible. I said, BS. And I said, what are the criteria in which you're sourcing and selecting those people? And they said, well, you have to be, like what you said, you have to be a former C-suite person of a publicly traded company. Guess what? That's correct. If you follow those criteria, it is almost impossible to find qualified, diverse candidates.
Yeah.
But I'm like, what are the criteria that you think match onto those things? Like, well, you have to be a good negotiator, you have to understand business, you have to da-da-da. I'm like, I fit all those things. Could I be, I wasn't a public, but I could do all those things. And they're like, well, I'm like, okay. So give up, either give up or like do it the real way. Like those are your options. Like either you have to source in different ways or find skills that match. But at those higher levels, people assume erroneously those things. With technical, it's much easier to do what you and I are describing, which is like
Look at the skills.
go to the skills. Like,
Yep.
can you code? Can you let me see your GitHub? Like I can do that without regard to race or gender.
And I would say you bring up a really great point about why recruiting without bias is very difficult, because there are these assumptions that we might hold, like we might hold them, groups of people might hold them, or you might encounter folks who say that they want to do this but are like, it's impossible. That kind of group, right? First, it has to be a mind shift, right? Like you have to get them to be committed to the idea that this is important. And once you commit yourself to the idea that this is important for our organization in these ways, that forces you to now think about the problem from a different perspective.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, there's this admiring the problem where people think they're solving a problem by admiring it.
Yeah, I
Like,
agree.
I've been in many rooms where people talk about the problem and challenges of diversity and inclusion. They put slides up, and everyone's like, we did it. High five, everybody. We care. And I'm like, hey, what are you guys doing at Home Depot to fix this? And they're like, well, we have these meetings and we talk about it. I'm like, oh yeah. So that's not, you're doing nothing.
So that comes back to my
Yeah,
that comes back to
nothing.
my first point about ways to address. It comes from commitment by leadership to make these changes, and by commitment, like that's the key word. It's not just saying that we're going to do it. It's saying, great, how are you going to do that? Here's an idea. Are you willing to implement the Rooney Rule? Are you willing to implement it and then also track it through your funnel and hold your hiring managers accountable to that? That's a yes or no. Is that a commitment or not? Great, you've made this commitment. Now let's write it down and track it, and we'll follow up at this next date. But that's like that is the first step of ways to address, is to get commitments, right? It's not enough just to say that we like it or that we want this to happen. It's great. Here are some ideas. Are you willing to try them? Great. When will you try them? When can I follow up with you on those?
That's awesome.
And that's not only if you are in the room with your leaders, but that could also be yourself as an employee bringing this up. I actually had a conversation with one of our employees who's on the Lambda X team. She's female and one of the only ethnically different folks on the team. And we had a conversation. She'd been feeling very frustrated because of this situation, not feeling like she's not heard. And I had a talk with her, and I was like, okay, I hear you. I see these things as well. It is top of mind, but I understand that it's not enough for us as leaders to say it. Let me actually give you insight into how we have been tackling this. First, we believe it comes with a commitment of leadership. Our leadership team was 3 white men and myself. Our leadership team today is 9 people. We do have 5 white men, but we also have 4 females of different varying ethnic backgrounds, right? So it's like, okay, we understand that diversity is important for us, but we come at it from first principles, that it starts here. So that's how we've recruited very heavily for our leadership team. And that's not knowledge that that's a long narrative to make a company announcement randomly on a Monday, right? And so through this conversation was able to show this employee, she was like, actually you're right. I can see how you've been making moves to do that. I'm like, yes. Now that we have a more diverse team of gender, of, backgrounds and upbringings and diversity of life experiences of where we come from, now maybe we as a team are better suited to start looking internally of how we're actually going to tackle this, because we all say it is. We've all committed to it. Now I'm just tasked with implementing it in a way. But it starts there first. And then it comes into, I've developed our hiring process. I hold hiring managers accountable to it. I'm willing to make exceptions for bandwidth and need for speed in closing a high caliber candidate, but I want that hiring manager to acknowledge that they are going out of process, and we talk about how that might help in these areas, but I force them to consider how might that complicate things in these other areas if we are committed to diversity and inclusion. So if I allow you to make this hire that is further throwing off the gender balance and further skewing the racial ethnic diversity or perspective background, what are you going to do for your next hire? How are you going to ensure that if you say this is important, how are you going to show me that in the next hire? It could be you come to me with a hire that you need sooner so we can build out a process and run one specifically. It is committing to having a different hiring panel. But that still comes down to what commitments are we asking of the folks running the hiring process, of our leadership, and how are we holding them accountable to it? It's kind of the two ways I see that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So if I'm writing our JDs, and again, I don't know, I'm in comms, but I'm clearly writing it the way that I see it in my eyes. How would I start to diversify the process?
From the JD process.
So how could I write a job description, or would I research you? How would I gain better language?
Yeah.
To be open, and then also if we're posting, or we're on LinkedIn recruiting, we're posting on Indeed, we're doing all of these things that we do.
Mm-hmm.
Again, is it just research, or how do I research ways to diversify where I place the JDs and all these things we're doing? I guess how do I get started in that process?
Yeah.
One thing to say, again, I don't want to be with what you're saying. It's one thing to be like, okay, great, I have the tools, let's go back, but I still have the skills maybe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So how do I gain the skills, or where do I go to start to gain the skills to do these things?
Definitely. That's a great question. So on that front, yes.
So just
Okay. Wow. Mhm.
Stay away from sports announcements, don't be like rock star,
Yep.
So that's the emails, there's a lot of research out there.
Mhm. Yep. Cool. So we only have about 3 minutes left. I actually really love this conversation and would love if I'd be open to sitting around outside and know what the next step in the agenda is. But happy to chat individually and brainstorm different ideas because I have ideas. I've heard Textio. There's a lot of ways to go there. So I'm just going to wrap up presentation really quick, and that's to say, like, one, that's how our hiring process is. But I do want to keep typing the wrong way. Acknowledge that, like, the next step in the recruiting process is offers, and this is one that I actually think merits its own workshop because I think it ties into what's your company's philosophy around compensation. Do you have a framework that you operate in? How is that framework built? This is something that I've built out for my company specifically because I want us to be able to say that we compensate fairly and equitably across roles and departments. But I just want to acknowledge that this is also another area that touches on diversity in ways that aren't always apparent to people. I was going to discuss what company's process looks like, but I don't think we have time to tackle that right now, and we've touched on it a little bit as well. And just generally, this is my contact information. This is what I think about in my day-to-day. It's also what I bring to our leadership team, continually to hold them accountable. We're launching our company retreat where we hope to unveil some more actionable diversity initiatives company-wide because we are much bigger now in such a short time. So I'd invite you to reach out to me anyway. But I don't know if we still have this room any longer, but okay, perfect. Okay, so if anyone wants to stick around, happy to talk about like actual tactics of what that might look like to get started. Cool. Thank you.